So it's my pleasure to welcome Aris Clemons to our Activism Progress session. I call her Aris, but she calls herself and her mum calls her Aris. So I keep forgetting that. She's an assistant professor of Hispanic linguistics at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, and specializes in the intersections between language, race, and identity. She's the quintessential polymath because her work not only spans the fields of linguistics, education, and anthropology, but also Black and Latinx studies. Racial justice, though, is the golden thread that binds all of her research together. And I first came across her work actually during the COVID lockdown, when colleagues at the University of Sheffield had the foresight to run a really wonderful series on anti-racist scholarship in the linguistics curriculum, which kind of foreshadowed some of the work that we in the LAGB's linguistics and racial justice space have also been driving forward. So I'm really keen to hear what she has to say today on a slightly different topic. So not curriculum as such, but moving into academic practice. So her talk is Anti-Racist and Decolonial Praxis in Language Studies, Restorative Justice through Academic Publication. So over to you. The floor is all yours.
Thank you so much for that warm introduction, and a really special thanks for all of the people on your team that put the labor into making this visit possible. It's one of our things that we really like to recognize, the labor that goes into the collective actions that we take in our kind of anti-racist spaces. So today I entitled the talk Anti-Racist and Decolonial Praxis in Language Studies, Restorative Justice through Academic Publication, and it's really kind of an overarching conversation about the work that I've been doing across two teams. One is a group of scholars that were funded through a 3-year Build and Broaden National Science Foundation project that was co-led by Doctors Ann Charity Hudley and Christine Mallinson. And the other is a group of education scholars from the assistant, associate, and full professor scope across the country. And so really what I'm doing today is kind of reflecting on the collective intellectual and political work that led to the creation of two journals. One is the Journal of Black Language and Culture, and one is the Journal of Racial Justice and Multilingual Education. And so I'll describe both of those things. And, you know, before I prepared this talk, I really wasn't quite sure who I would be talking to. And so some of these things may be a review, whereas other things will be kind of new conversations, and we can stop at any time if we need to like have questions or things like that, because I really enjoy an interactive experience as well. And so I will skip that and tell you, as is my practice, and again, apologies for folks who may have heard parts of my stories already, but I want to briefly situate myself as a research activist. And my colleagues and I have recently been advocating for naming our positionality when studying language, especially minoritized languages, because research is never neutral. And so who we are shapes the questions that we ask, the communities we are accountable to, the frameworks that we choose to apply in our work, and ultimately the interpretations that we make. And so in doing so, I want to acknowledge the important 2023 piece by Drs. Mildred Boveda and Subini Anama, which is cited on the screen now. And this piece was about the power and possibilities of positionality. They argue that positionality is not simply stating identity markers. So I'm not just going to say I am a Black woman from the United States. And instead of doing that, we want to critically examine how our social locations structure our relationships to scholarship. And so with that in mind, I'm going to offer my statement of positionality to clarify how I came to this work, how I approach these questions, and how my experiences inform the analyses that I will present today, but that I continuously present in my work throughout my scholarly life. So I'm originally from the San Francisco Bay Area, from all over it, in California, and I spent much of my formative years watching my grandmother and her activist colleagues defend the rights of African American language in what would lead up to the Oakland Ebonics debates of the 1990s. I was also sent to an African Montessori school as a child, where instruction happened in English, French, and Swahili. My father's African American, and my mother was born in Martinique, a small Caribbean island, movement. So I was raised around this kind of Black diaspora of African Americans, West Indians, recent African migrants. And these were the coalitions that I was formed under, and they grounded me in a passion for language diversity as well as for Black liberatory struggles. Importantly, I often consider the ways that my grandmothers, who are pictured on the screen here, had two very different approaches to communal liberation. And so while one was born in the United States, and was raised in the very multicultural context of San Francisco, even in the 1940s, she decided to take a kind of public service approach, creating nonprofits, clinics for women and marginalized communities. The other, a migrant herself, embraced a more explicitly activist path, joining local chapters of the Black Panthers and organizing in efforts that supported major civil rights cases in the 1980s and 1990s. But from their varied approaches, I learned that activism itself takes many forms. But what came down to was that the ultimate goal of this activism was the creation of systems or the support of systems that center self-determination and that also affirm the dignity and humanity of individuals and communities. At the same time, my parents made it a point to involve me and all of their children in all matters of debate, of adult conversations, of critical dialogue. And so from a very, very young age, I became attuned to the power of language, how it allows us to perform ourselves in particular spaces, and how all of these performances are always political. And so these lessons situated me pretty firmly within a Black feminist genealogy, and this grounds all of my work and approaches to my work as well. And so my focus on this kind of systematic study of Black and Latinx linguistic and cultural practices, especially in educational contexts, emerged from this kind of deeply personal recognition of how linguistic flexibility can often become a tool of survival. And so this awareness fuels my commitment to transforming the ways that we engage in scholarly publishing, as well as the ways that we engage in knowledge dissemination in general, so that the production of our knowledge itself becomes a site of liberation rather than exclusion. And so to bring it home, I want to share this quote from the Combahee River Collective as an expression of how I approach my work as a linguist and a scholar, and how I believe people, and especially Black people, continue to survive despite frequent attacks against their personhood. And so the quote reads, from the personal, the striving towards wholeness individually and within the community, comes the political, the struggle against those forces that render individuals and communities unwhole. The personal is political, especially for Black women, end quote. So understanding that there is no neutral, no objective, and no right way to approach the social science research has led myself and my colleagues to kind of question the role of language study in our understandings of social worlds, which has led to this framing of a model of liberatory linguistics towards racial justice. And that model of liberatory linguistics, which I'm sure you have heard of, is this kind of starting place for many of the publication projects that we've been involved in, but the two that I will describe in particular. I want to spend a little bit of time kind of briefly describing the model and its genesis before moving on to the projects. So to be sure, and quoting Dr. Ann Charity Hudley here, scholars of liberatory linguistics understand that there can be no racial justice without linguistic justice. And as a result, we define liberatory linguistics as a kind of epistemological approach to language study that pays homage to a long lineage of scholars who have persistently asked the question, who is all this linguistics work for? And instead of focusing on kind of the canon or a traditional model, we give the center intellectual stage to those who have been kind of punished or ignored for even asking that question. So in 2020, Charity Hudley and her colleagues described their vision of liberatory linguistics as linguistics designed by people from marginalized and racialized communities that is expressly focused on liberating their forms of communication and expression and humanizing their connections. So liberatory linguistics draws from Frere and Cohn, and it centers on the scholarship of teaching and learning of students in higher education as a crucial step towards linguistic justice. So I'll step back for a second, and I know some of you have heard me talk about this, but I'll just take a moment to quickly define linguistic justice. And this is a term that we've been using, and that's important when considering kind of liberatory linguistics because of this inextricable link between language and social categorizations. So linguistic justice is an action that redresses linguistic racism, linguicide, and/or linguistic discrimination. So again, for the purposes of my work, and I'll use it in this presentation, I want to focus for a moment here on anti-Black linguistic racism. And this has been defined by Dr. April Bickle-Bell as, quote, linguistic violence, persecution, dehumanization, and marginalization that Black language speakers endure when using their language in schools or in everyday life, end quote. So if we think about the policies and laws that have denied access to literacy during enslavement across the Americas or currently in many educational contexts, or if we think about the current book bans that are going on in my country, or if we think about the way that Siri or Hello Google only understand certain varieties of English, or in the United States that housing requests over the phone are like 3 times more likely to be denied when the voice is attached to a racialized accent. These are but a very few moments where linguistic racism impacts racialized communities. So if we're interested in equity and justice, in other words, liberatory linguistics, then we must attend to the ways that we understand, evaluate, conceptualize, and think through stigmatized and racialized varieties of language. And also, we must attend to the ways that we produce knowledge about these languages. So liberatory linguistics requires us to kind of reckon with the histories of our field, as well as our research context and the structures that define what counts as rigorous. And so in 2018, alongside and in response to a call for racial justice by Ann Charity Hudley and Christine Mallinson, who are pictured on the screen, as well as Mary Buckles, the Linguistic Society of America issued an official statement on the discussion and treatment of race in linguistics. And this statement emerged from conversations along leading scholars whose work centers the intersections of language, race, and society. And these scholars were not only linguists, they were also education scholars, anthropology scholars, historical scholars. And so the statement drew on this kind of interdisciplinary traditions and sought to bring linguistics into a sustained race theorization that was long present in these other fields. So the statement explicitly calls for expanding whose perspectives are included and for integrating methods from disciplines that have engaged race critically for decades. So in doing so, it opened up the space to kind of address both unexplored dimensions of race, as well as the inequality of viewpoints that were historically privileged in our field. And so building on these calls, scholars kind of outlined these concrete steps towards anti-racism and justice in language studies. They said that we needed to make explicit stances on race that called out racism, discrimination, and racialization based on language. They also said that we needed research that centered the language practices of those that were most marginalized, especially Black and Indigenous populations in terms of our global context. They also said that we needed to think about resisting the desire to compare dominant groups to non-dominant groups as a way of kind of evaluating linguistic practices, and instead center the communities or integrate the communities into our scholarship. And then finally, they said that we needed to share our work beyond academic spaces. And so while social media has expanded access, a lot of times the idea about what information we can trust has been lost in these conversations. And so we really were thinking about what are the ways that we can disseminate information that is reliable and rigorous while also staying attuned to our community needs. And so between 2018 and 2021, across the United States and beyond, many linguistics departments were like, yes, we need to do this. And they responded by issuing statements and action plans committed to justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. We see statements here on the screen from the UC Berkeley, the University of Oregon, the University of Chicago. And in some cases, the commitment extended to hiring practices. I probably got hired myself because some of these initiatives, but the job ads were really foregrounding initiatives in linguistics that were centered around inclusion and decolonizing the field. But many of the statements that I just talked about acknowledged that writing the statement was the easiest part. Enacting structural change, especially in diversifying hiring, in retention, in knowledge production, that was the far more challenging part. And then, as we all saw, they tried to ban us all. So with each headline that we started to watch, attempts to roll back commitments to inclusion and decolonizations, efforts to silence or ban the very conversations that we were having pushing the field forward, is a moment that we are finding ourselves in and have been finding ourselves in for the past couple of years. But amid these kind of reversals, we continue to gather in community because this is something that we do. We continue to strategize about how to sustain and advance this work. And we understood one thing, that like the backlash against what was happening between 2018 and 2021 let us know that the transformation of these systems is not really optional. So if linguistics is to remain intellectually vibrant, inclusion and decolonizations are not peripheral. They're central to the disciplines like legitimacy and survival. And I can talk in question and answer about how we came to that. Like, no, this is actually an imperative. We also came to recognize that we are the change that we've been waiting for. And so that recognition carries responsibility. And so without us ourselves being involved in creating equitable policies for teaching, for our research, for our service and community engagements, we will remain vulnerable to systems of inherited academic and social power. And so for Black scholars and other marginalized language users, the cost of simply maintaining the status quo is far too high. For me personally, the realization led to a series of publications and collaborative engagements. And so in one working group that's composed of women at highly intensive research universities, we began to kind of name these stresses that we were experiencing, and much of it stemmed from the multiple forms of gatekeeping that were operating on our campuses as well as in our fields. And so that collective analysis ultimately led us to develop a guidebook, which is forthcoming in the next couple of months. The QR code that's on the screen will lead folks to a pre-order. But it was through these kind of discussions, this very collective process that we were having, that we came to understand that publication itself must be part of our liberatory practice. And so rather than reproducing models that were centered on individual authorship and the myth of like the lone genius, we committed to communal knowledge production. We had weekly meetings where we talked about collecting data. We collected data together. We analyzed data together. We led the writing of individual chapters, each of us individually, and then edited each of the chapters collectively. We sent our books back to the folks that we were in conversation with and allowed them in on the editing process to really kind of adopt this community-based participatory approach to navigate some of the barriers that we were facing in academic publishing. And so what follows in the second part of this discussion is an account of how my two separate research groups arrived at the publication venues that I'll describe. And so we were really committed to transforming publication practices. And in one of them that I want to talk about, we decided to develop what we're calling the Journal of Black Language and Culture, or JBLAC. And so the roots of JBLAC, the efforts stretch back several years now that I think about it. What is time these days? In 2019, the Linguistic Society of America hosted a summer institute at the University of California, Davis. And there, a symposium was organized by Dr. Ann Charity Hudley, Mary Buckles, and Nicole Holliday. And that symposium was entitled Advancing African American Linguistics. And it brought a bunch of scholars together to reflect on a very central tension, at least in United Statesian linguistics. And this was that African American language had profoundly shaped the field of linguistics, especially sociolinguistics, yet African American linguists remained severely underrepresented within it. Moreover, research on Black language has too often relied on narrow or essentialized representation of Black communities, and too frequently these were conversations about Black people, but without Black languagers present to have these conversations. And so during that symposium, participants began to imagine what a journal dedicated to Black language, one that kind of would center Blackness as an analytic and recognize this inseparability between language and culture, what would happen? Like, so the idea stayed with us to think about this publication venue. And so over the next several years, we continued building community, mentoring Black students and scholars, and creating a space for the documentation and survival of Black knowledges. And so, grounded in this social justice-oriented work, the journal proposal became a kind of natural extension of our work. And because we were already collaborating as a research network, co-designing studies, co-analyzing data, co-disseminating findings, it was essential that we also created a publication venue that reflected those same values. And so, this kind of traditional white-centered scholarly model could not adequately hold the intellectual, cultural, and methodological commitments that were kind of guiding our work. And so in the summer of 2023, several of us from the networks came together to formalize that vision, drafting what would be our first proposal to the Linguistic Society of America and then to Cambridge University Press. And I'll explain a little bit how we came to that decision. And then after multiple rounds of peer review, syndicate votes, and sustained conversations about why Black languaging that centered Blackness as an analytic was like essentially imperative, we successfully moved the proposal forward, establishing what we are calling a liberatory publication space designed to build capacity and support for Black scholars across different career stages, across different institutional types, and hopefully something that can grow to be global in its impact. And so as we moved forward, one central question kept guiding us. And this is a question that was asked both in this group as well as my other research group. And it was, how could we engage in this work of creating this publication space? How could we engage in it collectively so that the burden of risk and the sacrifice did not fall on one individual? Instead, we were thinking about the ways that we could push forward towards systematic and structural change. So we debated at length whether to build something entirely outside existing institutional structures or to create a publication space within them. And so during this conversation, there were questions of visibility, funding, legitimacy, access to established networks, and all of these kind of conversations shaped that discussion. Ultimately, we decided to leverage the institutional relationships that many of us already had And it was not because those structures were not uncomplicated, but because we ultimately made the decision that transforming those spaces from within offered a kind of possibility of broader systemic impact in a shorter amount of time. We shall see how that works out. So again, we first proposed the journal to the Linguistic Society of America, and we did this because we were arguing that it should stand alongside the premier journals in our field. And this process required, like I said, multiple rounds of critique and formal review. And at the same time, the Linguistic Society of America was transitioning their publication venues or partnerships to Cambridge University Press. And so we were required to undergo Cambridge's full proposal process as well. And so rather than the like typical 2 or 3 anonymous reviewers that we get when we're kind of submitting a publication, we were given 10 reviews, followed by detailed responses and further reviews by a syndicate that really pressed us on our rationale and positioning. In particular, people were concerned about our insistence that Black language and Black culture are inseparable. Folks were like, this needs to be a Black culture journal or it needs to be a Black language culture. They also really pressed us on our insistence that Blackness itself functions as a theoretical analytic that's defined by scholars themselves, rather than as this kind of essentialized or purely racial category. And this generated significant debate. So we persisted in kind of explaining that Blackness as an analytic is what makes this space different. And so in doing so, J. Black now joins the ranks of established journals in linguistics and language study, and it's able to kind of draw on this institutional prestige while as legitimate knowledge within our field. So J. Black is the Journal of Black Language and Culture. It'll be the 4th major journal established by the Linguistic Society of America. And what we like to say is that the journal is by, for, and about Black life, language, and culture. And so we're committed to maintaining the dual focus of language and culture, not as parallel tracks, but as intertwined and mutually constitutive aspects of Black intellectual and expressive conditions. So the journal is going to fill a critical gap in scholarship by explicitly bringing together the study of Black language practices with the cultural context from which they emerge. And this is an intersection that's often overlooked by cousin journals, and it often brings linguistics into step with peer disciplines that already have Black-centered or race culture-centered journals, such as the ones that are listed on the screen. The journal also serves as this very inclusive interdisciplinary platform that centers Black language and culture through a global diasporic lens that expands traditional definitions of both linguistics as well as Blackness, and provides a dedicated home for underrepresented scholarship. So generally, we're looking to publish about 20 to 24 pieces annually. Every piece will be open access, and all the articles are processed as they're being received. Our first issue already has several articles that have already been processed, but they will become available in the 3rd quarter of this year, so around the fall. The majority of the articles have word limits between 8,000 and 10,000 words, and we have several submission types. So we're accepting review articles, empirical articles, interdisciplinary works, including multimodal artistic pieces with companion essays. We're accepting pedagogical tools. We're often thinking about the labor, the mentoring labor and teaching labor that marginalized scholars often produce without getting any credit for them, and wanted to create spaces for them to publish those works to get some credit for them. The 2 sections that I'm very excited about is a section on methodologies and approaches called How Did You Do That? And really focusing on researcher and researcher activism within the spaces. And then the student section called FUBU, For You, By You, where graduate students solicit and edit other student submissions that can be published in the journal. We're also accepting shorter pieces in the form of squibs. So if you're interested, we invite folks to submit their work. And at the same time, we are currently looking to expand our reviewer board as well as our editorial board. And so we had a call for editors and it just closed, but we'll open up the call to editors again annually and hope to have applications from some of our friends abroad as we attempt to kind of make some global impact. And so I know a lot of folks are probably not traveling to the United States, and I understand why, but we will be inaugurating this journal at next year's Linguistic Society of America annual meeting that's being held in San Francisco. And so we're inviting folks to join us from all over. And so having worked within that kind of institutional structure that required a lot of back and forth, a lot of outside folks' voices who were trying to tell us what we should be publishing, how we should be publishing it, I want to shift to a different model, one that pursues publication justice outside of this kind of bureaucratic gatekeeping that shaped much of this earlier process that I talked about with J. Black. And this is with the Journal of Racial Justice and Multilingual Education. And this grew out of workshops and roundtables at the annual meeting of American Educational Research Association, which is our very, very large, maybe 15,000 to 20,000 person conference. And we were having these conversations where some of us were reflecting on how difficult it was to center justice as like a core principle of scholarly practice. And what we were seeing was that way too often scholars that had been committed to justice found that their work was being marginalized or they themselves were being pushed out of spaces because their work was not fitting the mold of existing journals. So we decided to build our own space. But unlike J. Black, we could not rely on kind of large institutional publication venues. And so what that meant is we really had to create everything for ourselves. We created our own website, our own submission system. We did our own outreach. We structured our own review process, which is something I'm very excited about and we'll share in just a second. But from the beginning, we kind of committed to naming this inseparable relationship between race and language and to assuring that our editorial practices were aligned with our justice-centered values. And so at its core, RJME insists that race and language cannot be treated as parallel conversations. And in education in particular, these topics are deeply intertwined. And so our editorial team has grounded the publication process itself in equity, collective care, shared responsibility, so that how we publish reflects what we publish. And so our vision for racial justice and multilingual education emphasizes the need for transformative practices that value linguistic diversity, that challenge linguistic hierarchies, and that promote inclusive, equitable environments. And so we do this by emphasizing the importance of questioning deficit perspectives and perceptions, and we ask our authors who are going to be publishing to center that in their publications. And so what we're hoping is that together these kind of statements, these visions, work towards an educational framework that fosters racial justice by recognizing and celebrating linguistic diversity and by kind of dismantling deficit-framed understandings of the ways that the children that we're speaking about or the communities that we're speaking about use their own linguistic systems within these spaces. And so we describe RJME as a new open access journal. We have one issue already out and are working on our second issue. And the journal explores this kind of intersection of race and multilingualism, specifically within educational context. And so our mission is to build learning spaces where every perspective, language is seen and valued. And in doing that, our aim is to really challenge the racial-linguistic ideologies that have centered whiteness in both practice and publication and disrupt the language hierarchies that expand notions of multilingualism. And so we include lots of notions of translanguaging, the inclusion of multiple dialects of language, so publications in Black American English, publications in Chicano English, publications in other language, as well as multimodal productions. Sign language publications is something that we're also looking forward. And we are really thinking about the ways that we cultivate an inclusive community that's kind of guided by equity and collective decision making. And so for us, what's happened is that we are also publishing several types of submissions. Of course, research or empirical studies, research briefs, policy briefs, pedagogical and methodological pieces, as well as open formats that include creative and community-centered contributions, infographics, storytelling, interviews, student projects, parent resources, and a lot more. And you may notice that the pieces are shorter than in other journals. And this was like an active decision that was made based on our desire to center practitioners and other community members. We've invited independent scholars and community members to be part of our editorial board. We have very specific review processes. And the review process seeks to be very humanizing while also holding submissions to a high quality. And so the editors do a lot of what I like to call translation work. And this is where we get and gather the reviews from other scholars in our field or independent scholars in our field, and then we synthesize those and present them to authors in a video format where they can hear our tone, they can hear what's important about their work, they can also hear what aspects of the works we think that they can develop towards racial justice, and pushing conversations that may be surface level about race into conversations that can really push into racial justice. And so I'll close this section with an invitation to consider submission for work in racial justice and multilingual education if it aligns with this vision. And while we do set submission deadlines, we also remain flexible. And so this one has recently passed, but we will accept work. And as I said in our review process, we're committed to being very transparent with our authors who submit to let them know whether the work will be something that falls within our current timescale, something that falls within our current visions, or something that we can advise them to submit in other publication spaces. So our goal is not to police timelines or the manner in which folks are submitting things, but to cultivate this kind of meaningful, justice-centered scholarship. So I'll end with a quote from Octavia Butler that has been on my mind a lot and is constantly in my mind. I think about the ways that we can collectively shape and change the world and change. And Octavia Butler wrote, "All that you touch, you change. All that you change, changes you. The only lasting truth is change." And so with that, I encourage us all to keep continuing to be creative in our endeavors to combat anti-Black racism, linguistic injustice, systems of racial hierarchies that are always continuing to shift in order to rethink about their ways of subjugation. And I encourage us to think about how we can apply our own political praxis to our research context in ways that change the world. So I'll add my contact there if you have any questions. And I look forward to our discussion, our conversation about these publication practices.